They've been calling him arrogant, entitled, too confident for someone who hasn't earned it yet. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Everywhere Shedeur Sanders goes, broken programs suddenly start winning. And that pattern didn't magically stop when he reached the NFL. From the outside, it looks like another rough rookie season. A young quarterback on a losing team taking heat from fans, analysts, and social media. But when you slow the story down, something doesn't add up. Sanders didn't walk into a stable situation. He walked into chaos again. Weak protection, constant pressure, a team searching for identity. Sound familiar because it should. That's the same environment he stepped into at Jackson State. And Colorado, programs that weren't just struggling, they were irrelevant. No resources, no expectations, no patience. And every time he was asked to carry more than just the offense, he was asked to change the culture. Most quarterbacks run from that. Sanders leaned into it. Now he's in Cleveland and the noise is louder than ever. People are already questioning whether he's the guy, whether the Browns should move on, whether the confidence rubbed the wrong people the wrong way. But those same questions followed him before, right before teams took off. And that's what makes this moment different, because history is sitting right there and it's being ignored again. At the same time, Cleveland is staring down another massive decision: coaching uncertainty, leadership questions, and now rumors swirling around big names like Mike Tomlin and John Harbaugh. That matters because quarterbacks don't develop in a vacuum. They develop inside systems that either protect them or break them. So before writing off Shedeur Sanders, there's one uncomfortable question Cleveland has to answer. Is he the problem? Or is he just the latest quarterback dropped into dysfunction and expected to fix everything overnight? Because if history tells us anything, it's this: when Sanders is given time, structure, and belief, the results tend to shock a lot of people. And what happens next could determine whether Cleveland finally learns that lesson or repeats the same mistake all over again. The biggest mistake people made with Shedeur Sanders wasn't doubting his arm or questioning his readiness. It was misunderstanding why he spoke the way he did. From the moment he entered the NFL spotlight, the narrative hardened fast. Confident became cocky, direct became arrogant, and belief in himself somehow turned into entitlement in the eyes of critics who never fully examined his track record. That framing stuck, especially around draft season. When Sanders spoke about changing a franchise, some media voices reacted like he'd crossed an invisible line. But what rarely made it into those conversations was context. He wasn't talking in hypotheticals. He was pointing to results, real ones. At Jackson State, he didn't join a winning machine, he helped build one. At Colorado, he didn't inherit stability, he helped create it. Those weren't promises, they were receipts. The problem is, confidence without context makes people uncomfortable. Instead of asking why Sanders believed what he believed, critics focused on tone. They skipped the homework. They ignored the fact that he had already been placed in situations most quarterbacks never face: limited resources, losing cultures, immediate expectations, and didn't flinch. That history matters because it explains why he talks the way he does. When someone has been asked to fix things repeatedly and succeeded, their confidence isn't borrowed, it's earned. What's ironic is how quickly that narrative flipped once he reached Cleveland. Suddenly, the same confidence that was labeled arrogance was expected to disappear. He was supposed to be quieter, more deferential, more patient, even though patience had never been afforded to him before. The expectations shifted, but the pressure didn't. And that's where the disconnect lives. People weren't evaluating Sanders as a developing quarterback in a difficult situation. They were reacting to an image they'd already built in their heads. Every mistake reinforced it. Every strong moment was minimized. And instead of asking whether the environment was holding him back, the conversation jumped straight to whether he belonged at all. That's why this narrative is so misleading. It ignores pattern, it ignores precedent, and it ignores how often Sanders has walked into skepticism and walked out with results. This isn't about defending every throw or pretending flaws don't exist. It's about recognizing when criticism stops being analytical and starts being personal. Because once a label sticks, it becomes easier to dismiss progress than to acknowledge it. And for Shedeur Sanders, that label may say more about the conversation around him than it does about the quarterback himself. Long before the NFL noise, Shedeur Sanders was already being shaped by chaos. Not the kind quarterbacks usually face, but the kind most are protected from. His career didn't begin inside polished facilities or stacked rosters. It started in situations where failure was expected and excuses were already written. When Deion Sanders took over at Jackson State Tigers, the program wasn't just losing, it was overlooked. Limited resources, minimal national attention, almost no margin for error. And that's where Shedeur was placed immediately, not as a backup, not as a project, but as the centerpiece. Reports and first-hand accounts suggest the expectations were extreme from day one. He was asked to lead grown men fresh out of high school, to win right away, to elevate teammates who had never experienced success at that level, and to do it without the infrastructure most Power 5 programs take for granted. Rumors from people close to the situation claim he absorbed pressure most quarterbacks don't see until years later, and he never pushed back. Instead, he delivered. Jackson State didn't just improve, they exploded. Back-to-back dominant seasons, national relevance, a complete cultural shift. And when that chapter closed, the chaos didn't end. It followed him. Colorado was next, a program coming off a 1-11 season, buried under years of irrelevance. Again, no safety net. Again, no patience built into the timeline. Sanders was asked to start over completely in a tougher conference under a brighter spotlight. And once again, reports suggest he was told, figure it out now. What happened next changed his reputation forever. In 2 seasons, Colorado flipped from an afterthought into a contender. From 1 win to 9, 1 game away from a conference title appearance. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a quarterback is wired to handle instability without breaking. And that wiring didn't come from comfort, it came from repetition. That's why the current NFL moment feels familiar. Sanders didn't arrive in Cleveland spoiled or untested. He arrived conditioned to noise, to skepticism, to being doubted before the story even starts. And that matters because players don't suddenly develop resilience, they carry it with them. So when people say this situation is too much for him, they're missing the pattern. Chaos isn't new territory for Shedeur Sanders. It's the environment he's always been built inside. If Jackson State planted the seed, Colorado removed all doubt. When Shedeur Sanders arrived in Boulder, the situation was arguably worse than before. The Colorado Buffaloes weren't just coming off a bad season, they were coming off a 1-11 collapse. Confidence was gone, national relevance was non-existent, and expectations, at least from the outside, were almost insultingly low. Once again, there was no easing into anything. Sanders was asked to lead immediately in a Power 5 conference under one of the brightest spotlights in college football. Every snap was televised. Every mistake was amplified, and every critic was waiting to say Jackson State's success wouldn't translate. This was the test people claimed he hadn't passed yet. What followed made that argument hard to maintain. In his first season, Colorado tripled its win total. That alone was a shock, but it didn't stop there. With roster upgrades and continuity, Sanders led the Buffaloes to a 9-3 record, 1 win away from playing in the Big 12 championship. That wasn't incremental improvement, that was a transformation, and it happened fast. What often gets lost in the record is how it happened. Colorado didn't dominate with overwhelming talent. They competed through execution, leadership, and composure in moments where teams used to fold. Sanders wasn't just putting up numbers, he was commanding games, making adjustments, absorbing pressure, and keeping the locker room aligned through constant national scrutiny. And the scrutiny was relentless. Every game came with commentary about hype. Every loss was treated like exposure. Yet the wins kept stacking. And by the end of the season, the conversation quietly shifted. The same voices that doubted whether Sanders could elevate a program now had to explain how two different rebuilds in two completely different environments produced the same result. That's when fluke stopped being a serious argument. Colorado proved that Sanders' impact wasn't about comfort, conference, or circumstance. It was about adaptability, about walking into instability and making it functional. And that matters because quarterbacks who rely on perfect systems collapse when conditions change. Sanders has done the opposite. He's thrived because conditions were unstable. So when people question whether his success translates, the answer is already written. Jackson State wasn't a one-off. Colorado wasn't lightning in a bottle. It was repetition, the same pattern playing out on a bigger stage. And once you recognize that pattern, the NFL conversation looks very different. Because quarterbacks who repeatedly elevate broken situations don't suddenly forget how to do it. They just need time, structure, and patience to do it again. By the time Shedeur Sanders arrived in Cleveland, the pattern had already repeated itself, just at a higher, harsher level. This wasn't a quarterback stepping into stability. This was another reset, another rebuild. Another situation where patience was talked about publicly but rarely practiced in reality. The Cleveland Browns were searching for answers, and Sanders became part of that search before the foundation was ever set. From the start, the environment felt rushed. The offensive line struggled to hold up consistently. The run game never fully settled. Weapons rotated in and out, and the margin for error shrank quickly. For a young quarterback, that's the worst possible combination: constant pressure with very little insulation. Yet despite all of that, Sanders wasn't handed the keys and told to figure it out over time. He was judged in fragments, short appearances, limited starts. And every moment felt like a final exam instead of a learning curve. Still, the results complicate the criticism. In 7 starts, Sanders won 3 games. That number doesn't jump off the page until you zoom out. Cleveland finished the season struggling across the board, cycling through inconsistency at multiple positions. And yet, during Sanders' starts, the team showed flashes of structure. Drives didn't constantly collapse. Turnovers were limited. The offense, while far from explosive, looked manageable, something Cleveland had difficulty sustaining all season. That's what makes the conversation uncomfortable. Instead of asking what Sanders could become with support, the focus quickly shifted to whether he was already enough. That's a familiar mistake. It's the same one made at Jackson State, the same one made at Colorado, expecting immediate transformation without first fixing the surrounding issues. Quarterbacks don't lift broken systems alone, they amplify whatever's around them. And in Cleveland, what surrounded Sanders was unfinished. There's also the leadership layer. With uncertainty at the coaching level and pressure on the front office led by Andrew Berry, clarity was hard to find. When an organization doesn't know exactly who it's building around, development becomes uneven. Mixed messages follow, and young quarterbacks feel that instantly. This is why labeling Sanders' Cleveland stint as a failure misses the point. It wasn't a finished environment. It wasn't a stable roster. And it certainly wasn't a long runway. What it was, once again, was a broken situation asking for a fix before the tools were in place. And if history has shown anything, it's that judging Sanders before the build is complete has never ended well. What makes this story harder to dismiss isn't just film or stats. It's the people who have been around Shedeur Sanders long before the spotlight followed him. One of the most revealing moments came from someone in his inner circle, someone who's seen every stage up close. Not a coach trying to sell a narrative, not a fan defending a favorite player, but someone who's watched the pressure pile up year after year. The message was simple, but heavy. Sanders has been carrying more than people realize for a very long time. According to those closest to him, Shedeur wasn't eased into leadership, it was forced on him early. Fresh out of high school, he wasn't given a soft landing. He was dropped into programs that lacked resources, stability, and expectations of winning. And instead of shielding him from that reality, he was asked to shoulder it. Build this, fix that, lead now, win immediately, no excuses. What stands out is that he never pushed back. There were no public complaints, no demands for better conditions, no hesitation. The response was always the same: let's go. That mindset carried him through Jackson State, through Colorado, and now into the NFL. Each stop followed a similar pattern: chaos first, confidence questioned, pressure amplified. And every time he answered the bell. That perspective matters because it reframes the current criticism. What some people interpret as arrogance looks very different when you understand the background. Confidence doesn't come from entitlement, it comes from repetition, from being put in difficult situations and surviving them, from being trusted with responsibility when others would have been protected. People close to Sanders have openly said this Cleveland situation isn't new territory for him. Losing environments, public doubt, external noise, all of it is familiar. The difference now is scale. The NFL magnifies everything. Every mistake is louder. Every opinion travels faster. But the core challenge hasn't changed. It's still about patience. They also acknowledge something important. Sanders has scars from carrying teams early. Physical and mental, where that doesn't show up in box scores. That context matters when evaluating his development. Growth doesn't always look explosive. Sometimes it looks like endurance. That's why those closest to him aren't panicking. They've seen this movie before. They've watched him walk into bad situations, absorb the blame, and come out better on the other side. To them, this moment isn't a breaking point. It's another test he's been prepped for his entire career. And that insider perspective exposes a gap in the public conversation. Because while fans debate ceilings and timelines, the people who know him best are focused on one thing: whether he's finally given the patience he's never been afforded, despite always delivering when it mattered. If the conversation around Shedeur Sanders is ever going to be honest, it has to shift away from labels and start focusing on infrastructure. Because quarterbacks don't fail in isolation, organizations fail them first. And when you look closely at Cleveland, the gaps are obvious. Start up front. The offensive line never provided consistent protection. Breakdowns came early and often, especially off the edge. That forced Sanders to speed up reads, abandon progressions, and absorb hits that young quarterbacks shouldn't be taking. No scheme survives that for long. Fans can debate arm talent all day, but without tackles who can actually hold up, evaluation becomes distorted. Quarterbacks don't develop confidence when they're bracing for contact every snap. Then there's the skill position issue. Cleveland lacked a true, reliable WR1, someone defenses have to account for before the ball is snapped. Route timing suffers without separation. Windows shrink. Mistakes multiply. Asking a young quarterback to elevate average pass catchers while under pressure is one of the fastest ways to kill momentum. Depth matters, but so does hierarchy. A real number one option changes how defenses play and how quarterbacks breathe. The run game didn't help either. Inconsistent lanes meant defenses could sit back and tee off on passing downs. Play action lost its bite. And when the offense becomes predictable, pressure skyrockets. That's not on the quarterback, that's on construction. Balanced football isn't a luxury, it's protection. This is where leadership comes in. With Andrew Berry overseeing roster decisions, the next phase matters more than any hot take. Cleveland isn't far away. A few linemen, a true WR1, commitment to a run identity. Those aren't glamorous fixes, but they're foundational. And without them, cycling quarterbacks won't change outcomes. What also gets overlooked is patience. Not the fake kind talked about in press conferences, but real patience built into planning. New quarterbacks don't thrive when every snap feels like a referendum. They thrive when mistakes are absorbed by structure, when coaching, scheme, and personnel align long enough for growth to happen. That's the real fork in the road for Cleveland. They can keep asking quarterbacks to overcome flaws the roster creates, or they can finally do what successful franchises do: build first, evaluate second. Because until Cleveland fixes what's around the quarterback, debates about whether Sanders is the guy will always be premature. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If Cleveland actually addresses these needs, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders won't need defending. The answers will show up on the field. This is where everything converges, not on a stat sheet, but in a decision room. For the Cleveland Browns, the coaching hire isn't just about leadership style or resume. It's about direction. And more specifically, it's about what kind of environment they're willing to build around Shedeur Sanders. Two names keep circling the conversation, and neither is small. Mike Tomlin and John Harbaugh represent stability, authority, and credibility, the kind that instantly changes how a locker room operates. Reports and on-air discussions suggest both names are being floated in league circles. Nothing confirmed, nothing signed, but the fact they're even mentioned says a lot about how serious this moment is. Tomlin's name sparks debate immediately. He brings discipline, consistency, and a reputation for getting buy-in without coddling. But there's history here. Comments he's made in the past about Brown's decisions, particularly around roster management, haven't been forgotten. That raises a real question. Could Tomlin and Andrew Berry align long-term? Because alignment matters. Without it, even elite coaching turns into friction. Harbaugh represents something slightly different: structure without volatility, a clear identity. Reports claim he prioritizes quarterback clarity above all else. If that's true, Cleveland's pitch, even hypothetically, suggests the organization doesn't view its quarterback room as hopeless. That implication alone reframes the Sanders conversation, because coaches of Harbaugh's caliber don't step into guessing games unless they believe there's something to build with. Of course, this is where speculation must be handled carefully. Neither coach has committed to anything publicly. Other teams have been mentioned as stronger fits, and Cleveland has a long history of being linked to big names without landing them. Still, rumors don't gain traction unless the stakes are real. And the stakes are massive. Whoever takes this job will define Sanders' development timeline, the language used in meetings, the margin for error on Sundays, the difference between growth and survival. Elite coaches don't just call plays, they control temperature. They decide whether mistakes become lessons or labels. That's why this hire matters more than any roster tweak. Cleveland isn't just choosing a coach, they're choosing a philosophy. Do they want immediate control or long-term cultivation? Do they want certainty now, or structure that allows it to form? Because once that decision is made, the Sanders question answers itself, not through debate but through direction. When everything is stripped down, the hot takes, the labels, the impatience, the situation surrounding Shedeur Sanders comes down to one unavoidable question Cleveland has been dodging for years. Is the problem really the quarterback? Or is it the environment they keep asking quarterbacks to survive in? History keeps offering the same lesson. Sanders has walked into broken situations before, not once, not twice, repeatedly. Jackson State, Colorado. Each time the story started with doubt and ended with results. Those turnarounds didn't happen because everything was perfect. They happened because, eventually, structure caught up with responsibility. And once that balance existed, growth followed. Cleveland hasn't reached that balance yet. Instead, Sanders entered another unstable setup: inconsistent protection, rotating weapons, leadership uncertainty, and a fan base desperate for instant answers. In that kind of environment, patience feels like weakness. But impatience is exactly how franchises stay stuck. Judging quarterbacks before fixing what's around them doesn't create clarity. It creates churn. That's what makes this moment different. The Browns are at a crossroads, not just because of a coaching search or roster decisions, but because the pattern is staring them in the face. They can either repeat it, rush conclusions, reset again, and start over with the next name, or they can finally change how they evaluate quarterbacks altogether. This isn't about declaring Sanders untouchable. He still has development ahead. He still has flaws, but development doesn't happen in chaos. It happens in systems designed to absorb mistakes instead of amplifying them. And that responsibility doesn't fall on the quarterback first. It falls on the organization. The coaching decision will reveal everything. Whoever steps into that role will determine whether Cleveland prioritizes control or cultivation, whether young players are protected long enough to grow or pushed until they crack. That choice will shape Sanders' future more than any stat line ever could. And that's why this conversation matters beyond one player. Because if Cleveland decides Sanders isn't the answer before they fix the question, then the next quarterback will walk into the same trap, and the next one after that, until the cycle breaks. So the real question Cleveland must answer is whether Shedeur Sanders can lead them. It's whether the Browns are finally willing to build an environment worth leading. Because if they are, history suggests Sanders doesn't just survive those situations, he elevates them. And if they aren't, then this story won't end with him. It'll just repeat itself again, with a different name under center and the same unanswered questions hanging in the air.